Our next speaker is Vice Admiral Dirk Debbink, Chief of Naval Reserve. Vice Admiral Debbink graduated from the U.S. Naval Academy with a Bachelor of Science in Systems Engineering in June 1977. He completed his Master's in Business Administration at the University of Chicago in June 1990. During his initial period of active service, he served aboard USS Fanning, FF-1076, and as Flag Aide to Commander, U.S. Naval Forces Japan in Yokosuka, Japan. Admiral Debbink transitioned to the Reserve Component in 1983. During the next 19 years, he was assigned to numerous selected reserve billets, supporting Navy and Joint Forces active component commands in the United States and overseas. Selected for flag rank in 2002, he has served in reserve component flag billets in the Pacific and Navy Region Midwest, including Reserve Deputy Commander and Chief of Staff, U.S. Pacific Fleet. He was called to active duty as Deputy Chief of Navy Reserve in October 2007. Additionally, he served on the Secretary of Defense Reserve Forces Policy Board from August 2006 to July 2008. Admiral Debbink became the Chief of Navy Reserve on the staff of the Chief of Naval Operations in Washington, D.C. on 22 July 2008. As a drilling Navy Reserve sailor, prior to his call to active duty, he was chairman of a regional design and build general contracting firm in Oconomowoc, Wisconsin. Ladies and gentlemen, please rise and help me in welcoming Vice Admiral Dirk Debbink. On deck.
Good afternoon, please. Carry on. Carry on. Have a seat. Okay, thanks a lot. Good afternoon, everybody. All right. So that's the first challenge, right? Being the speaker right after lunch. Keep everybody awake, keep everybody going. It's a real privilege for me to be here today. First of all, as a graduate of this institution, to have the opportunity to come back and stand on a stage here at the Academy is a real privilege. But second of all, to talk with you for about an hour or so here on one of my favorite topics, one of the topics that I consider to have been a lifelong journey of mine, learning and, if you will, studying and reading about leadership, and maybe share a few thoughts of what I've kind of learned along the way, perhaps, but most importantly, hopefully after about 20 minutes of droning on here for about what's going on and what I'm thinking about is to hear from you all and get some questions from you. So that'd be my goal today. So thinking about coming out to visit with you all and putting together some thoughts, I looked up on my bookshelf in my office, or my home office in the Washington Navy Yard, and I quickly counted about 30 books on leadership that were up there, different leadership titles, different authors. And I thought, okay, let's see, that either makes me an expert or a neophyte, because I need all these books to learn about leadership, right? And, but it did tell me, I was surprised how many were up there, that I started thinking about the whole topic of leadership and leadership development, how much I have thought about it and read about it, and yet perhaps how little I still know today about it. So it's a two-way conversation. I will tell you that many times when I'm reading one of these books, and my wife happens to notice I'm reading it, and my wife Terry's in the audience right here. Terry, wave your hand. Hey, there's Terry. Thank you, Terry. She'll say, "Why don't you read something fun for a change?" You ever get that question? Any of you reading a leadership book? And I would reply, "How? This is fun. I enjoy reading this." You know, so but every once in a while I do pick up another book as well. I also reflected on looking at the brochure that was sent out on the whole program, and of course you have a couple of pretty incredible speakers coming here to join you all. Secretary Ridge yesterday, would have loved to have heard him myself. Mr. Ackerson this afternoon, this evening, chairman of GM. Would love to have spent time with him. The sponsor, Mitch Hart. Is Mr. Hart here by any chance? We don't know if he's here probably. But reading through his bio and some of the great things he's done. And then of course in the program, I looked and we shot you all my standard Navy bio, which is, you know, probably the shortest bio in the program. And so I would like to kind of fill in some of those holes for you as I start out, so you know perhaps some of the context for some of my remarks. So I want to go way back because it has to do with leadership. And that is that I think one of the reasons I'm standing here today, perhaps the main reason I'm standing here today in uniform after 38 years since I became a plebe here, and about 34 years since I graduated, was the Boy Scouts of America, frankly. And so I started out in early days in the Scouts and went off to some things like, we called them junior leader instructor training and pine tree training, and I was the senior patrol leader in the troop, you know, all these early leadership experiences perhaps. But having people there, mentors of mine, pushing me into these roles and these positions. I was asked at lunch by Margaret, I see Margaret sitting out here from American University, how I ended up here at the Academy. And my honest answer was, it was my ticket out of town. You know, Oconomowoc, Wisconsin was a great place to grow up, and we moved back there, so we raised our kids. But at age 17, I wanted to get out of town. So it wasn't that I was looking for a leadership opportunity or leadership challenge coming here to the Naval Academy. I was looking for a free education. And frankly, once I got here, I discovered this institution was a lot more than just providing a free education. And obviously, by standing here today, there's a spark that was kindled that became a flame in me to serve our country in uniform for the rest of my life. Well, not quite, because then about 6 years after I graduated, I had a challenge put in front of me to make a big decision. I call it the most important decision I ever made in my life, and that was to either stay in the Navy on active duty or to leave the active duty, to leave the Navy. Back then in 1983, we called people like myself quitters, if you will, because we were quitting. And I went back home to Wisconsin to join my father in what was a family business at the time, designing and building buildings. Perhaps my biggest leadership challenge of my life, because coming into a family business where everybody says the only reason you're there is because you're the son of the owner. And to have to prove yourself in that situation was certainly one of the larger challenges I faced. Fortunately, fast forward to a number of years later, was perhaps the best decision I ever made. Was able to live in the same house for 25 years, raise our family, raise a pretty successful business. We'll talk more about that later, I think. And yet still come back and serve on active duty now, as I'm in the middle of about a 5-year recall to active duty as a Chief of Navy Reserve. So that was a huge challenge, but also a lot of opportunities back in a hometown. And again, we're going to talk about some of those, both in the not-for-profit sector. For example, becoming the president of a chamber of commerce that was deeply in debt. And why'd they choose me, to jump into that role to help them get out of debt? Or perhaps to become the president of a church council where the church was basically crumbling under the weight of an old committee structure which just wasn't serving the church's needs anymore, and they needed someone to help figure the way through that. Or perhaps one of my favorite actually was the opportunity I had to join a community bank board of directors, a nice mid-sized community bank, and there were 9 of us directors. Wonderful opportunity in 1998 to join the board. And then I'll never forget in November 1999 when the then chairman, Mr. Dowd, passed away unexpectedly. And of course, 2 days later we had a board meeting. And I'm the junior board member, and they go around the board table, who's going to be the next chairman? It's not me, not me, not me, not me, not me, until it got to me, and I was the only guy left. And so I became chairman of the bank, That reminds me of the movie we just saw this past weekend, King's Speech. Anybody seen King's Speech yet? It's a big movie, right? So King George, as he becomes known, did he want that role? Did he ask for that role? Absolutely not. He avoided it to the best of his ability. And I kind of felt like that when I was thinking back when I was watching the movie. That reminds me of when I became chairman of the bank, and that all worked out pretty well as well. Also, the good fortune of serving on a much larger board of directors for an insurance company, a Fortune 500 insurance company. And all the while doing that, serving in the Navy Reserve. So I think somewhere about 7 commands in the Navy Reserve I had the opportunity to be part of, until I became a flag officer in 2002. And then shortly after that became the commander of Navy Reserve Region Midwest with about 10,000 sailors. The biggest organization I'd had the opportunity to lead up until that point. And then a couple of years later became the Deputy Commander and Chief of Staff Reserve, but when activated, the actual Deputy Commander for U.S. Pacific Fleet, about 120,000 sailors. And now the Chief of Navy Reserve for 65,000 sailors. So the perspective I wanted to give you on that was organizations as small as literally our private company of, at the time when I got there, 14 people, then growing to 61 people, very small company, to very, very large organizations in the Navy primarily, but also in the civilian sector with the Fortune 500 board that I sat on. So reflecting back on all of that and the opportunities I had and were given to me. First question I think many of you are dealing with or have talked about already is, are leaders born? Are people born leaders? Or are some people born to lead? And are some people neither one of those but thrust into leadership positions to discover that they can lead? And I would offer, and I'm probably not alone in this thought, that there are very, very few George Washingtons, for example, people truly that are born leaders. I would offer, though, that I think many, many people, and perhaps many of you in this room, are born to lead. And most of you probably have already discovered that you have some of that in you. And for me, it was, I think, going back to literally my days as a Boy Scout, where I was perhaps forced into some positions early on, but I discovered, you know what, I did that pretty well. And when you do something pretty well, what happens? You feel good about it, right? It's kind of like an elixir, if you will, you know. And in fact, one of our main roles, when we talk about this more later, I'm sure, as leaders is to put people in positions where we think they might do well, so they will do well, so they'll get that good feeling and want to go back to the well again, if you will. I think that I look back in my life and I had a lot of those opportunities because people put me in those positions usually, most times. Other times they were, as I mentioned before with the bank board example, where I was thrust into the position and didn't go looking for it. But I think very, very few people are actually, if you will, born leaders. So what is it about somebody that we can identify in them that he or she would be somebody that we should push into these leadership positions? What do you look for in a person? Or perhaps is it sometimes, again, maybe I'm overusing the example, the bank board example, the only person left standing in the room, you know, so that's the person you go to. Well, I would offer, obviously, there are many different characteristics that we look for in people who we look for leadership to. And I'm sure you've brainstormed some of those already. Things like discipline and ethics and energy and enthusiasm, people who inspire you, a lot of different characteristics. I know if you Google, you know, characteristics of leaders on Google, you'll come up with pages after pages of people who will tell you these are the 10, or these are the 12, or these are the 5, or whatever. And I would argue that I'm not sure there's any one subset. In fact, I think probably the most important thing is for leaders to, as a core set perhaps, but to discover what's inside of themselves that helps them become successful. And those are the characteristics that hopefully that they'll continue to develop in themselves. So if people are not born leaders, but they're perhaps born to lead, or you discover you like to lead, and you want to be a leader, whose job is it to train you to be a leader? As I've already mentioned, I think there is a role for all of us to push people into leadership roles to see how they do, to give them the opportunity to succeed. I think it's a big part of what the Naval Academy is all about. And in fact, I understand next year going back to 36 companies here at the Naval Academy, which we had back in the 70s. And the main reason for that, according to Vice Admiral Fowler, is to give people more leadership opportunities. If there's 36 companies instead of 30 companies, obviously there's more opportunities to put people into. What is our role then? To push people into those kind of leadership roles and to allow them to discover in themselves through self-discovery, introspection, through reading those 30 books on my bookshelf perhaps, through experimentation, what works, what doesn't work, perhaps learning about what it takes to be a leader. I believe my own life and kind of watching how my life's developed, that is an individual responsibility. The organization has responsibility to put you in leadership positions, but you have a responsibility of your own to really figure out what it takes to be a successful leader. The organization does have, I think, some very important responsibilities, though, and both in my civilian world and in the military world, I've taken advantage of those. Kind of group them into perhaps 3 main areas. The first is what I call situational leadership development. So the organization is going to set you up into a new role of some kind. I'll use the example most recently in my role as the Chief of Navy Reserve. First time I've had the opportunity to lead an organization of 65,000 sailors. And so the Navy sent me off to something we call transition training. It was down in Chapel Hill, a great leadership opportunity down there with some of the faculty they have. And challenged us all as we thought about where we were going into to first and foremost identify the type of organization we were going into and where it was at in its life. There's a book called The First 90 Days. I forget the author. Has a acronym called STARS that he talks about, S-T-A-R-S. So STARS, S, the first S, is for are you going into a successful organization, one that's doing really well. The T-A, are you going into an organization that's ripe for a turnaround, that's in big trouble. You need to get at something right away or this organization's going down. Or the R is an organization that's doing okay, but it definitely needs a realignment because of whatever's happening in technology or the world is changing around it or whatever. Or perhaps the final S is a startup organization. And the realization and the training that it's important you identify what kind of organization you're going into because each has a different need or a need for a different type of leadership style perhaps, different sense of urgency, different constituents you have to play towards. And so that was very enlightening to me. And I came in an organization that was very successful at the time. We were in the middle in 2008 of the largest mobilization of Navy Reserve sailors literally since World War II. And we were doing very successfully. Our sailors were doing great all around the world. Debbink, don't screw this up. This is really important to our nation's defense. And I think we've done pretty well. Maybe we can talk about that a little bit more later. So I have to give you the Navy Reserve pitch here eventually, tell you about the reserves. So that's an example of situational leadership training that I think was really, really important. Another area that I think is important is technical training. We as organizations owe it to people we put in leadership positions to give them a technical training they need, because I think one of the core competencies of good leaders is to be technically competent in your job. Might sound obvious, but if you're not technically competent, you're going to have a hard time perhaps inspiring those that you're trying to lead to follow you, for good reason probably. So I think back to my civilian world jobs when I came in into our company, design, build, construction company, as I mentioned, and I felt it was important if I was ever going to lead this company that I better know what I'm talking about in the construction world, so I went to night school and eventually wrote the PE, the Professional Engineers Exam. I had the good fortune of writing it not once, but twice, which means I failed it the first time. But all good, because passed it the second time. And that gives you that credibility of being a professional engineer in that business, really important. But I also found that wasn't enough, because later on, a year or two later, we were dealing with the largest project our company had ever done to date. And it was a development project with lots of other entities involved. I found myself, and Terry can attest to this, literally staying at the office till midnight or later every night, struggling, trying to figure out how to make some really key decisions. And I realized that I didn't have all the tools that I needed. And so went back to school, and as you heard in my bio, got my master's in business administration from the University of Chicago. It helped me immensely because it gave me some of those really important tools. So technical training is really important. Fast forward or talk about the Navy for a second, and we do a great job with that as well, I believe, in the Navy. Some of it's pretty obvious. If you're going to be the commanding officer of a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, and you've been an aviator all your life, guess what? I think we better send you to some nuclear power school for a while so you understand how the ship is run. If you're going to be a commanding officer of one of our surface ships these days, we just started again, finally, this program called the Surface Warfare Officers Maintenance Course. It's SOSMARC, I forget exactly what it stands for. But we used to have this course, and we stopped giving it to our COs, and they went out to the waterfront not understanding how important it was to maintain their ships in ways that we've been able to prove over time will be successful in making sure the ship gets to its service life. So we started this course back up again. These leaders needed this technical training. So situational leadership training, technical training, lots of other examples I could give you. The third area I think that's really important that we do give a lot of focus on in the Navy, and that is ethics. And perhaps even qualify that with situational ethics. And what I've been perhaps constantly amazed by throughout my life is as much as you think you know about ethics, and ethics in business or ethics in life or ethics in military, or John Maxwell will tell you there's no such thing as business ethics, there's only ethics, the way you run your life. The situations you will encounter as you move through life, as you become more senior, you get positions of increased responsibility, the ethical dilemmas you find yourself in will change. And I've definitely have taken a lot out of the training that we've gotten. And a lot of times, it's stuff that you perhaps, it's not so much the situation as the perception of the situation that matters. And so you get into these kind of discussions where, you know, this doesn't make sense, and yet you have to make sense out of it. The paradoxes, if you will, that confront many people. Some of it is at a very junior age as well. Some of you, especially those in uniform, will be posed with some very difficult ethical decisions, perhaps in the very near future, especially if you're deployed out to Iraq or Afghanistan, where I just had the privilege of spending a week, 2 weeks ago, out with our sailors, our soldiers, airmen, Marines, and Coast Guardsmen out there, doing incredible work, but also daily facing some very difficult ethical decisions as they're going perhaps village by village, trying to ferret out the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, and yet making sure that we respect and certainly cause no harm, do no harm to the peaceful civilians that live throughout all these neighborhoods. There's an interesting article about General Peter Pace, who just retired now almost 4 years ago, actually, is our chairman of the Joint Chiefs, who talks about an experience he had in Vietnam when he was a second lieutenant. And I forget the time, the time frame, the span of time, but I think it was something like less than a week that they were on their third squad leader. It became him. And so he's thrust in this leadership position. Perhaps didn't ask for it, although he is an officer in the United States Marine Corps, you kind of expect it, but thrust in this position. And one of his best friends is killed by a sniper. So the first thing he does is get on the radio to call an airstrike to wipe out this village where the sniper fire came from. Until he stopped, thought about it for a minute, talked to somebody else in his company there, and they decided that that was not the ethical decision at the time. That was the easy decision. That was the emotional decision. That was a decision that was going to take the fight right back to where that shot came from that killed his best friend. But the right decision was to call off the airstrike and to go into that village and go hamlet by hamlet, hut by hut, and try to figure out where the shot came from. Much more dangerous path than calling an airstrike, but the right decision. And General Pace will tell you that that decision stayed with him for the rest of his life. And he also spent the rest of his life serving on behalf of the Marines that had fallen on either side of him. So those three areas I think we owe to people to train them, whether it's the military or the civilian world. And I think there are many differences perhaps between military and civilian. Maybe we can talk about that, get some of your questions. But I also think there are far more similarities perhaps than there are differences. I wanted to maybe just wrap up with one more thought I have, and that is that I believe that what you believe will drive how you look at this whole idea of leadership and leadership development. Of course, what you believe also drives everything in your life. I believe what you believe, what I believe, will drive our behaviors, and they will also drive then the results in our life. Have a good time at class this afternoon, guys. Please leave if you need to. I know you have a 13:20 class, something like that. You missed the best part, though, which is the questions and answers. I think it's important for us all to stop and think about what we believe about leadership development. Do you believe there are born leaders, or do you believe that people are born to lead, or do you believe that everybody is on an equal footing and they need to be trained to lead? Do you believe the organization has a responsibility, all organizations have a responsibility to train leaders or not, and if so, in what areas? I've laid out the three that I believe we have to pay particular attention to. So I hope that's helpful. I'd also want to offer that I think it's important that we also develop beliefs about our lives, and especially if you have a desire to lead in life, Because I believe that although leaders are often held up, put on a pedestal, certainly the President of the United States, but maybe a Vice Admiral. They give my wife and myself a very nice set of quarters to live in Washington Navy Yard, big house, leadership symbols, status, and all that kind of stuff. But I believe at the heart of it, leadership and leaders are just like any other occupation out there. If you're going to be a scientist, if you're going to be a stockbroker, if you're going to be a banker, if you're going to be a mason, if you're going to be a plumber, all of these occupations are needed. And the world does not go around. Our country will not be successful without all of them. So leaders just happen to have, perhaps, what it takes to inspire other people to do well. Perhaps have what it takes to see the vision of what it takes to get to a successful result. Perhaps somehow are given the drive and the energy to get up every morning and go to work. Or as I used to tell my kids all the time, I get to go to work every day. They'd say, come on, Dad, you don't really mean that. And I say, no, I get to go to work. That's a whole other line of thinking, by the way, because if you don't believe you get to go to work every day, then I'd recommend you find something else to do. Because there's a job out there for every one of us that we get up in the morning, we can't wait to get to work. So I hope you find that job, as I have in my life, not once, but as I recounted earlier, perhaps a dozen or more times. So those kind of beliefs drive my way of thinking. I also believe that I think it's very important that each of us, whether we're a leader or not, take responsibility for our own lives first and foremost. I happen to be a real fan of Stephen Covey. I think it was 1992. Life was going pretty well. I've been back into my civilian job in Midwest for about 9 years by that time, and we'd just come out of the early 90s recession, and we're at least a slowdown in the economy, and we're coming out and doing pretty well. I was feeling pretty good about things, and I sat down one night. I was actually on a 2-week active duty of the Navy out in Coronado. I still remember where I was, in the BOQ there, and picked up this book somebody recommended, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And normally, I'm asleep by about 9:30 or 10 o'clock at night, get up early, but that night I stayed up till 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, so I was so enthralled about Covey's 7 Habits and his principle-centered life. And there's also a book you all know, I'm sure, Principle-Centered Leadership as well. But first and foremost, habit number 1, be proactive, which means take responsibility for your own life. I also believe that, as I mentioned before in a leadership context, but just in general, that every one of us has infinite worth, that we were created that way, and that I also believe that the only person that can take that worth away from us is ourselves. And I would highly recommend a great book by Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning in Life. And you'll learn about his journey through Nazi concentration camps. And if you can maintain personal worth and dignity in that situation, there's almost nothing else in life, obviously, worse than that. I believe we also have a responsibility, each and every one of us, to give something back to society, to seek to somehow or another contribute at the highest level we can. And in doing so, there's even a really interesting paradox then if you've ever read Ayn Rand and her series of book, Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged, that even by optimizing or maximizing your own personal self-worth, if you do it in a truly egalitarian way or utopian way, that you'll maximize all of civilization. I don't necessarily describe everything she talks about, but I thought it was a very interesting point. And again, the point here maybe is to read a wide variety of topics. Finally, I also believe that there's a thing called grace at work in the world, and that if you get out of your own situation and you seek out other people and you're open to things that come into your head for whatever reason and act on them, that interesting things will happen to you. And most often, very good things will happen to you. And whether it's crazy stuff like selling buildings like I was doing back in the Midwest in the 80s, and for some reason somebody's name would pop into my head, and so I'd call them, and lo and behold, they were just getting ready to call me. How does that happen? You know? Or walking the halls of the Pentagon today. one of the things I enjoy doing is engaging people. Now, they don't always want to engage me. You know, they see a 3-star coming down the hall. Usually they scoot over the side of the passageway and put their head down and kind of go the other way. But we're all going through this journey called life together. And if we can be open to each other and we can help each other along the way, I think that we'll all find it a lot more enjoyable. So that's what I believe. And that's why I'm standing here in front of you today. And I'd love to hear from you all and talk a little bit about your thoughts on leadership, and perhaps we can share ideas back and forth. And the first person will be what have you talked about this week so far? You've got a series of questions I know that you were probing and asking about. All right.
All fight, sir.
Super.
Sir, Cadet Order of the United States Military Academy. Go Army, win something.
Well, you know what? I got to admit he's right. Go Army 364 days a year. There's just one day in December where...
Yeah, fair enough, sir.
All right.
So I asked this question, it was the first panel about if there's a separation between the professional life and your personal life. And in the military, the answer is easy. It's no. You're on 24/7. What you do in your personal life is your professional life.
Yeah.
But I didn't feel the last panel really answered the question. I'm wondering why, as members of our society, that we almost disregard a, say, senior politician or senior business leader's professional life, and we separate from their personal life, or vice versa.
Yeah.
I'm wondering how we make a distinction between how we're okay with that as a country. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think you've made some perhaps fairly accurate observations there that we have perhaps even a zero tolerance in the military, although we'd like to say that we don't have a zero tolerance because people learn by mistakes they make. We like to say in the military what we're looking for is those who, what we're not looking for, what we discover though, those who have what we call a fatal flaw, those we need to move on, if you will, but that hopefully people can make mistakes. Although I would offer that we perhaps err more on the side of assuming it's a fatal flaw versus a mistake that they can learn from. As you point out, perhaps not so much in the civilian world, where we seem to tolerate a lot of perhaps indiscretions and things like that. But I referred to a book earlier that I liked a lot, and that was, I think it was John Maxwell's book, There's No Such Thing as Business Ethics. And he talks in that book about something that I think is a pretty powerful concept, and it's not the golden rule, it's the platinum rule, teaching others as they want to be, or treating others as they would want to be treated, not as you would want to be treated, that kind of thing. And there's no such thing as, just ethics on the job. It's how you run your life in total. And I would offer that, watching people over the years, yes, you can be successful trying to separate your personal and business life, or your personal and your military life. But those who are most successful don't see a distinction. Those who are most successful would ascribe to that thing that there's no such thing as situational ethics. They allow you to be less discretionary at some times in your life than others. So I think it's probably more similar than you might think. Okay? Yes, please.
Sir, Midshipman Third Class DeLong. How did you make the transition from active duty to the reserves while keeping your feet in the private sector and also in the military world at the same time?
Great question, actually, and it gives me a chance to talk about the Navy Reserve a little bit, so thanks for the reminder. So as I mentioned before, I think the most difficult decision I ever made was to leave our great Navy. I loved it. And a little bit more about that story, if you will, because I think I had to make the decision about 6 to 9 months in advance. You have to submit your letter. And back then we didn't have email, believe it or not. There was a time without email. That's back in '83. And Christmas of '82, I get a letter from my father, who was running this business at the time. And it starts out, "Son, not sure how to tell you this, but if you can reverse your decision, you probably should. I'm not sure the company will be here when you get back," because we were in the middle of the early '80s recession. And it's like, you don't understand, Dad. I don't have a choice. I'm already out. They won't let me back in, if you will. So it was a very difficult transition for lots of reasons. As I mentioned before, the schooling that I needed to be successful in the civilian world, while still maintaining, wanting to wear the uniform. So that's why today, yet, as Chief of Navy Reserve, as many people are talking about operationalizing our reserve forces, that's a phrase they use. And as late as just yesterday, I was on a panel in Washington, D.C., where we were talking about this with the other reserve chiefs as well. I always push back and say, no, we're not operationalizing the Navy Reserve. We're not going to be an operational Navy Reserve. We're going to be a Navy Reserve with strategic elements and operational elements. Oh, by the way, same as the active forces have both strategic elements and operational elements. Because when in the 80s, I needed to be very strategic, if you will. I mean, 1 weekend a month and 2 weeks a year is all I could give the Navy until I got my feet on the ground. We had 3 small children at the time. Later on, our 4th, Matthew, was sitting over here, first class midshipman Debbink, was born in 1988. But that was a very difficult time. So we got to keep this balance in our life. And then right in the middle of all that, you have some things happen to you that either in a business world, a difficult job I mentioned before, where I needed the additional training, or opportunities that come along, like the opportunity I mentioned about the Chamber of Commerce that was deeply in debt that needed somebody to help them figure out the way through. And so you rise to those kind of challenges. I'm not sure if I answered the question or not. But,
Yes, sir. Thank you,
yeah.
sir.
So good luck to you as you make those difficult decisions in life as well. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Good afternoon, sir. I'm Shimon Curtis from Boston Unit ROTC. And I was wanting to know, because you were talking about grace, sir, and I would like to know your comments on just the simple quote, love your enemies, and how that applies to the military and just to the way you've lived your life in general.
That's an interesting question. I'd have to think about that one for a minute. Maybe ask you about it too, but let me take a stab at that. Because what first came to mind when you said that, frankly, was in the business world, if you will, who are your enemies? Mostly your competition, right? That's the enemy out there. And interestingly, I learned a very early lesson in business life when I was out trying to sell someone to buy one of our buildings. And I made the mistake of talking about one of my enemies, and how bad they were, certainly not loving them, that's for darn sure. Well, come to find out that the company I was talking about was owned by the husband of the sister of the person I was trying to sell a building to. So that didn't work out real well. I learned that lesson. That I think the most important thing to do in life is to live your own life, and to be the best you can be, and keep working to improve yourself. And that would be the business analogy. In the military, very difficult to start talking about how we love our enemy. Our enemy is not the Army. Our enemy is not the Coast Guard, the Air Force, or the Marines by any means. They're our partners, and so obviously the enemy are the people we're fighting, and very difficult to do that. Come back at me with some more what you're thinking about, though. That answer the question, or?
Yes, more or less, sir.
Yeah.
For just taking it into account of the military perspective, because often we don't think about the way the enemy is thinking, or how do we say that in general, most people say that all humans are equal, to bring it to philosophy kind of debate, sir.
Right.
How do you make people with different cultures and stuff like that are obviously not for America, yet all at the same time have the same rights and values that we do?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I would offer that our oldest daughter, who's in the State Department, would tell me, Dad, we're not always right. And, as we're building democracies around the world, some great conversations that we've had lately, both with her and others, that talk about us imposing our form of government, lock, stock, and barrel, and perhaps rather than doing that, what we need to do is to offer up things like rule of law and human rights and those kind of things, and help build those kind of institutions within countries, and then allow them to figure out how best to govern themselves. Because what's really important in the end is it the type of government, or is it the way the people are governed, that really counts perhaps. Good questions, good thinking.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, good thoughts. Over here.
Sir, Midshipman, Second Class Alex Foley, United States Naval Academy. My question is with regard to the cultivation of leadership climate. When you consider your place in the hierarchy and you look to your left and right in your planar state, what is the best way to lead your peers when your legitimate expert and referent source of power doesn't carry as much weight as it otherwise would? And what does the role of character have in assisting you to lead those people side by side to accomplish your mission?
Yeah. Those are great thoughts. Obviously, very well thought out question, something you've been thinking about for a while. And it happens all the time, and perhaps even more so now, for example, in my life than it ever has before. Because so much of what I need to get done in this job that I'm in right now, there's no chain of command, there's no authority. You know, it's about those all around you, both peers as well as people who are senior as well as people who are junior, but who are not in a chain of command. And so, you know, how do you influence events when you don't have that chain of command, for example? And that's an interesting conversation, by the way, between the military and the civilian, you know, where there's very clear chain of command usually in the military and the civilian much less so. But for example, the role I'm in right now on the Chief of Naval Operations staff, there's 7 of us 3-stars. One's kind of a super 3-star, if you will. He's a director of Navy staff. And there's 6 of us that are pretty well equal 3-stars, if you will, each with a different portfolio. Then there's, of course, the Chief of Naval Operations and the Vice Chief. So there's 9 of us that sit on what we call the CNO's Executive Board. And so, you know, how do you work with the peers, I think, the question you were asking me, you know. And so the 6 of us, I think the harder that we can work towards helping each other, literally, every day, and frankly, without any expectation of anything in return. Another great author, by the way, Zig Ziglar, if anybody's into sales and things like that. One of the things Zig Ziglar said that struck me when I heard him speak back in 1984 was help enough other people get what they want and need in life, and you'll have everything you could ever want or need in life. And so I think that applies in this situation. And daily in our work in the Pentagon right now, you know, if there's anything I can do to help out anybody else, especially my peers, I look forward to doing that. As I mentioned before, I think that we all need to be students of leadership, read lots of different books. One of the ones I'll always remember reading was the book, It's Your Ship. I don't know if anybody's read that or not. And the author of that book talks about his own leadership style. I would offer that the one exception that I took to that book was he was pretty emphatic in his book that, in his style of leadership, that he did not do that with his peers on the waterfront. He was a commanding officer of a ship. There were other ships on the waterfront. And he found that they were dragging him down, I think is kind of the way I recall reading the book. So I would offer that's not the way to go about leading with your peers. Is that helpful?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
I think it's an interesting point, too. And I hope this is all non-attribution here, right? But to read and not always, you know, you're not always going to agree with everything you read. Or to observe leaders. You do that all the time, right, in all of your organizations. And you pick the things that you think you like and things that work and things, you observe things that don't work as well. And so that's an example of that as well, I think, too. Okay? Yes, sir? Thanks for stepping the mics, you guys. You're getting me scared there for a minute. No one's going to come to the mic, so.
So this is Cadet Tongoi, senior at the Air Force Academy, but also an international cadet from Kenya. And just recognizing that we live in a globalized world.
Yes.
And an international system which the U.S. helped to create and in which it has a lot of influence. And this requires a lot of international competence from the emerging leaders, both civilian and military. And my question is, what advice would you give to these future leaders of the U.S. On how to engage with the world in such a way that they're able to align and find the common denominators in the interests, in U.S. interests and global interests as well?
Great question. Thanks for the opportunity to talk a little bit about international partners. And by the way, probably February 1980, Mombasa, Kenya. And was I a Lieutenant JG by the time I might have been? had my Schwinn 10 speed tucked away on the ship on deployment, and went ashore in Mombasa and jumped on my Schwinn and rode all around outside of Mombasa into some of the villages and stuff like that. What a sight that must have been, huh? I mean, a stark, white, thin, male riding through Mombasa. Where did that guy come from? This flash of, on a bike go by or whatever. So if you saw a bicycle guy go through your town back then, it's probably me. How about that? So let me use that as just the first step of saying, number one, I'd offer the advice is get out in the world. Go live overseas. It was in 1979, late 79, my wife and I had the opportunity to go to Japan. You heard in my bio to spend 2 years in active duty, and we agonized for a while over it, and we finally said, what the heck, let's go see what the world is like. And it was the best thing we ever did, perhaps. And even now to this day, I love traveling. I love working in the Navy and the military. We get to work a lot of not only joint but coalition and international partners, and it's some of the best work we've done. And I would offer that when you're out there doing that, when we're out around the world, as I said before, we don't have all the answers. In fact, just the opposite. One of the really cool things that happened in my military career was in Korea, where I became the commander of the U.S. Harbor Defense Command. So I was working with the Koreans to help defend their ports. And up until that point, we had very little information about how the Koreans would defend their ports. We had all this stuff that we'd bring in, the mine, inshore, underwater techniques and abilities that we had, and we'd bring in our patrol craft and all that kind of stuff. And we'd tell them how we were going to defend their ports. And finally, the light bulb came on one day and said, here's what we have. How would you like to use what we have? How do you think we could best integrate what we have with what you have? And it took an hour or two, but all of a sudden, the great friends, the Republican Korean Navy, began to believe that we were serious, that we were going to let them employ our forces how they thought best. And pretty soon, I'll never forget it, we go into a back room, literally part these curtains, and throw open these big doors, and here's a 4-layered defense plan, for their ports. All they were doing was waiting for us to come to the table as equal partners versus coming in as the heavy-handed Americans who knew everything. So from a large organization point of view, whether it's a corporation or the military, I'd offer that. And the other thing I'd offer is to just try to develop personal relationships. Look the other person in the eye. Try to understand what their journey through life is all about. Share a meal with them. Share a cup of tea with them, whatever. Thanks for being here. Awesome.
Hello, sir. I'm Joe Giordano from representing Penn State University.
Outstanding.
I'm in an organization at Penn State, and I'm worried about the next round of leaders that's going to take over for me. And I was wondering what strategies you've employed in the military world and in the civilian world for identifying people that you think would make good leaders and then helping them to evolve into that role before you put them into that role.
Yeah, it's a great question, and one that perhaps I'm not sure any of us do it as well as we need to. I think about a number of situations in my life where I wish I would have done better with that, because you're so busy doing what you're doing every day, right, that you forget to make time to try to figure out how you can put these the next generation that comes along, perhaps put them into positions where they can try out their leadership abilities, and also, by the way, where you can kind of watch how they do as well, right? I would offer that we do that, I think, a lot better in the Navy or in the military than we do perhaps in the civilian world. And one of my thoughts would be in the Navy, by the time you make E4, so, the 4th enlisted rank, which is usually probably only 2 or 3 years into your career in the Navy, we call you an officer, a petty officer. And from then on, you're always an officer. So I would offer that in the Navy, we create, if you will, or we have leadership positions for people from, relatively junior time on. By the time you're, 19 or 20 years old, you're put in charge of a work center, or you're put in charge of 20 sailors. I was talking to a sailor recently who started out down in the bowels of an aircraft carrier cleaning the bilges, and he pretty quickly figured out that the faster he got promoted, the faster you get out of the bilges, and the faster you get to the flight deck and start leading sailors. And so he worked pretty hard to get out of those bilges. We have a lot of those opportunities in the military. I think they're probably much There's a fewer of those perhaps in the civilian world, and so you maybe have to even create them, set up committees or something like that where they can have a go at it, if you will. And then at the end of the day, sometimes it ends up being the vacuum that's created when you leave, that vacuum will somehow be filled, and hopefully by the right person. Not sure that's helpful.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Yes, sir.
Hello. Thank you for your speech, sir. My name's Colin Lee. I'm representing the Warren School of University of Pennsylvania. I was wondering if you can touch upon your experience at the University of Chicago, your MBA, particularly besides the degree, the technical knowledge, and the networking opportunity. I was wondering if you had a chance to grow as a leader in that field during those 2 years, because you mentioned a lot of self-learning, continuing to educate yourself. How do you know when it's time to do that, and then when it's time to get a degree at an institution?
Yeah, that's a great question. As I alluded to, probably for me, I was in extremis. I was over my head. I needed some more tools, and I realized that because of the late nights at the office. I figured, hey, there's got to be a better way here. That's probably not the best way to do it. It'd be better to be a little proactive about it, and get the training perhaps before you need it. I think probably a couple things that happened during that 2 years at University of Chicago, and perhaps any MBA program like that, especially if you're trying to hold down a job at the same time also while maybe being a Navy Reserve sailor, is it's taxing to say the least, just from a pure time management point of view. And so because of that, that also forces you to look deep, first of all, perhaps to do things you didn't think were possible even, which, by the way, I think is one of the things we do here at the Academy, and all the academies do, is put you in situations that when you first start down that path, you say, there's no way I'm going to be able to accomplish this. This task is too hard. There's not enough time. It's too difficult. And you discover that, by the way, first of all, you reach deep within yourself and you can do it. That's a leadership learning point. You also learn that, no, you can't do it yourself, but you got a teamwork or teammates around you, and you bring them all in. And oh, by the way, that's a leadership opportunity as well, I think. And then at the end of the day, you also develop, especially in a program like one of the MBA programs, and all of your schools have great programs here, I'm sure, that teach you some really important shortcuts, if you will, because you go through the learning process to get from where you are to the nugget at the end, the thing you've learned at the end, and you don't have to go through all of the macerations in between anymore, because you know that when this set of circumstances presents itself, the solution is going to be like this or similar to this. So I'd offer that helps a little bit. Okay? Yeah, thanks. Yes, ma'am.
My name's Sarah, representing the University of the Pacific. My question is, I know the military is based on tradition, but with the repeal of the Don't Ask, Don't Tell, how's that going to restructure the leadership quality?
Good question, actually, because it's a current question. Obviously, we're dealing with the path. We're on the path right now towards the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Of course, Congress has voted. The process that we're going through is a process of training, and train the trainer. We've actually, right in the middle of it right now, literally the first tranche of people being trained are people like the lawyers, believe it or not, And the second level of training is going to be to the leadership. And the third level of training will be to all of our service members. And we think that'll go through pretty quickly to the point where each of the service chiefs can certify to the Secretary of Defense that we're ready. And then the Secretary of Defense, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Admiral Mullen, and the President need to certify to Congress that we're ready. And then we go into a 60-day period after that, and then we finally will repeal the Don't Ask, Don't Tell regulations and the way we do that. So what changes will that cause in our Navy or in our services? I truly believe, I think there'll be little to no changes. We need to do a very good job of making sure that we have all the regulations and policies in place so that leaders aren't put in very difficult situations. But when you get right down to it, if you really do believe, as I said before, that each one of us has infinite worth, and each one of us is created equal, and each one of us has something to offer the organization, And if you enforce behavioral rules, no matter what a person's private beliefs are, heterosexual or homosexual, doesn't matter, there's still certain behaviors we ascribe to in the military. It won't matter, and we'll do very well. It's all about treating individuals with respect and being dedicated to the mission. And that's the path we're on, and I think it'll go very well.
Thank you.
You bet. Yes, ma'am.
It says on, okay.
There we go.
Hi,
Hi.
I'm Laura from
Hi,
the
Laura.
University of Pennsylvania. I guess one of the biggest challenges for me when I went to college was developing the ability to say no
Oh,
to
absolutely.
things. And
Yeah.
I often find that I overwhelm myself by signing up for too much.
Yeah.
And find that I don't do the things I really want to do
Yeah.
to the best ability that I can. And I was just curious to ask how you prioritize your time, and you're only given 24 hours in a day, and just how you have developed the tool to say no to certain things and to give yourself time to do what you want.
I'm smiling, and I caught my wife's eye, and I think the honest answer is not very well. And also because I have a lot of people that I'm codependent upon, right, that allow me to do a lot more perhaps sometimes than I should. And so first of all, I'd recommend finding a great life partner who will tell you exactly like it is whenever you need to be told that. I know I would not be the person I am today without the opportunity to go through life with that person in my life, my wife. But I will also tell you that in my role now as a leader, and one of the areas that's most evident to me is every year we select those captains in our Navy who will become admirals. And then we hold a training session for them. And one of the main points of that several days worth of training is the hardest thing you will ever do from now on is say no. But you absolutely have to say no. Because especially as a flag officer in the Navy, you're going to be asked to do something literally, some things every day. People are going to come at you and want you to do this and want you to do that, and you can't do it all. And oh, by the way, the greatest power in saying no is it gives you the ability to say yes when it's really, really important. So it is difficult, especially when you have the opportunity to do things that will matter and will make a difference. How do you say no to something like that? I'll refer back to, I think, probably the lesson that I learned best, and it goes back to Stephen Covey and the 7 Habits. If you know the 7 Habits, he talks about P versus PC, which is production versus the production capability. It's the golden egg versus the goose, and we are all geese, and we all have the ability to lay golden eggs, but only if we take care of ourselves. And of course, the mission of the Naval Academy here is prepare midshipmen mentally, morally, and physically. And it used to be really short. Now it's a really long mission statement, so I can't repeat it all anymore. I don't know it all anymore. But that's basically, the idea of keeping balance in your life. And I would offer that it's really important at all stages in life, but I'd offer I think even more important as I've gotten older to keep that balance. And it's not easy. I knew I was coming here today, just as an example, though, and I don't like talking about me, perhaps, but so this morning at 6 o'clock in the morning, I'm at the gym working out hard because I know that I'll do a better job for you all if I worked hard in the morning, worked out hard in the morning. So it's all those kind of balance things in life that makes it very difficult. But
Thank you.
the power of saying no is to be able to say yes, right? Thanks for your question. I appreciate it. You got time for one more? Last one?
Sir. Good afternoon, sir. Midshipman, 2nd Class McLeod, 26 Company.
26 Company, all right.
Sir. Throughout
That's the
this
son
conference,
Company Matthews in our son, so there you go.
during this conference, a lot of attention has been directed towards the military and business spheres of leadership. Many often forget that another important sphere of leadership is one's family unit. It's the basis that our success as a nation is built off the way that you're raised. So with that in mind, How has your experiences as a husband and father helped you become a better leader in the Navy?
Great question. As a matter of fact, in my speech notes, which obviously I didn't use at all today, one of the things I left out on the leadership opportunities I've had throughout my life, and in my notes it's entitled the co-leadership opportunity of raising 4 children. And I think your question is, how does that relate back to the military or perhaps even the civilian? And I'd have to think about it for a minute perhaps, because I'd offer that that's perhaps one of the biggest challenges in life is raising children, raising a family. Many of you in the room have done it as well. And wondering how that family's going to come out, you know, what kind of children will they be someday? And I think Matthew's left for class, right, Terry? He's already gone. So I think the most important thing, perhaps back to the question, I think it was about, talked earlier about ethics and are there different ethics for different situations, is consistency in my life, in our life. Believe it or not, children also have infinite worth, even when they're arguing with you, even when they're crying, even when they're being defiant, you know. And I think that perhaps we learned that as well, raising our family. Here's just a quick example how maybe that played out. Was we found our children were saying no to us a lot. Ever happen to anybody? Children say no to you? And then one day, I don't know if I was reading something or just one of these discoveries or something, where do children learn to say what they say? They learn it from us as parents. Well, guess who was saying no more to them than they were even saying to us? You know, they'd ask us things and our answer was always no, because we're too busy, we're doing this, we're doing that. The answer is no, 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 no. You know, and so they say no, no, no back. So my wife and I discovered that, and we said, okay, from now on, before we say no to our children, we have to count to 10 before we can say no. And we discovered that well before 10, usually by 2 or 3, we got to yes, by discovering that there was some way we could accommodate what our children were asking us to do. And so I just offer that by living your life consistently, both whether you're at business, you know, how do you treat your best customer? How do you treat the admiral? Do you treat the seaman the same? Do you treat the receptionist the same? Do you treat your children the same? And if you do, I think you'll find that there's all kinds of ways that all those work together, and you'll be successful in all 3 of them. How's that?
Thank you, sir.
Good. I didn't mean to preach. Sorry about that. Just offering you my perspectives on life. I think that's why you invited me to come here and come here to speak with you all. It's been a real privilege to spend time with you. When I first saw the agenda and read through all what you're all doing, my choice would have been, frankly, to join you for the entire 2.5 days, just so we can have these kind of conversations. I love talking about leadership, and I know that I have much more to learn. If I'm very fortunate, I'm a little bit past perhaps the halfway point in my life, and I'll have lots more opportunities to continue learning ahead. And I applaud the work that you all are doing, and I wish you the very best of success. And thanks again for the opportunity to be with you this afternoon. Thank you.
Sir, on behalf of all the participants and staff of the Leadership Conference, I'd like to present you with this gift. Thank you for sharing your insights with us.
Thank you, Ralph. Thanks much. Thank you, sir. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it. Thank you.